The Frontier Female Labor Economy, a forensic re-examination. The real story is something else entirely. These are 20 facts about Old West saloon girls that the movies never had the nerve to tell. If you love history that actually tells the truth, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It genuinely helps us keep making these. On number 20, we're starting with the sober strategy. Picture this. A dimly lit saloon in Dodge City, 1878. A cowboy slides a whiskey across the bar and winks at the girl beside him. She smiles, picks it up, and drinks. What he doesn't know is that he just paid 75 cents for cold tea. Saloon owners replaced every drink ordered for a girl with dyed water or cold tea poured into a shot glass. The customer paid full whiskey price. The girl stayed stone cold sober all night. And here's what nobody talks about. This wasn't just a small trick. It was official policy across hundreds of establishments. A girl who got drunk, couldn't work, couldn't sell, couldn't earn. The whole warm, hazy scene you've seen in every Western, a performance top to bottom every single night. On number 19, the shocking wages. And here's a detail that even seasoned historians find remarkable. A successful saloon girl in the 1870s and 80s could pull in around $10 a week in base salary alone. And that's before a single commission. The crazy part, a popular girl averaging 50 dances a night, each ticket worth 75 cents to $1, could make more in one single night than a railroad worker or a ranch hand made in a full month. And in an era when the only legitimate work available to women was laundering, cooking, or teaching school for about $1.50 a week, this was life-changing money. Think about that the next time a film shows these women as helpless background characters. They were in many cases the highest-earning women in their entire town. That was the secret the respectable ladies across the street desperately did not want to acknowledge. On number 18, we're talking about the dance ticket economy. Because the drink wasn't even the main money machine, it was the dance ticket. Here's how the whole system worked. A customer paid between 75 cents and a full dollar for a dance ticket. The proceeds were split between the girl and the house. After the dance ended, and most dances lasted about 90 seconds, the girl's job was to walk that man straight to the bar and sell him a drink, on which she also earned a commission. Then back to the floor, then back to the bar. 50 times a night, in a corset, in heeled boots, on a hardwood floor. No sick days, no overtime. Think about it. This wasn't entertainment. This was a full-contact, high-endurance sales job dressed up as fun. Modern bottle service clubs run the exact same playbook. The only difference is that at least today the girls get to wear comfortable shoes. On number 17, the painted ladies slur. And the term painted ladies sounds almost charming today, but it wasn't. In the Victorian era, it was a social weapon, a single phrase that could end a woman's reputation permanently. Here's the detail nobody talks about. In proper Victorian society, makeup on a woman was not a fashion choice. It was a public confession. Wearing rouge, tinting your lips, or God forbid, dyeing your hair meant exactly one thing in the eyes of polite society. That you were a woman of the lowest moral order. Respectable women were pale, plain, and proud of it. So when saloon girls arrived in town with painted faces and bright-colored hair, the community reaction was visceral. They weren't just fashion rebels. In the eyes of everyone around them, they had voluntarily branded themselves as outcasts. And most of them made that choice anyway because the money was real and virtue wasn't paying the rent. On number 16, the fashion rebellion. And while we're talking about what they wore, let's be very clear about how genuinely shocking it was. Saloon girls wore skirts that hit at the knee or mid-shin in an era when showing an ankle was considered borderline obscene. Their shoulders were bare. Their bodices were cut low. Their dresses were covered in sequins, fringe, and silk. They wore colored stockings held up by garters, which were also gifts from admirers. To every proper woman in every Western town, this was practically an act of public provocation. But here's the twist that almost never gets mentioned. These same women were in many cases buying their own property, opening their own bank accounts, making their own financial decisions. Decades before women had the legal right to vote, saloon girls in frontier towns were quietly practicing a form of economic independence that their supposedly more respectable counterparts couldn't even dream of. On number 15, the refuge of the displaced. And this one will change how you see every single one of the others. Most saloon girls didn't choose this life as an adventure. They chose it because there was literally no other choice. Most were refugees from farms, textile mills, or abusive households back east. Many were widows, women whose husbands had died on the frontier, leaving them with no income, no family network, and a society that offered them almost no options. They were recruited by posters and handbills promising high wages, easy work, and fine clothing. Some arrived expecting dancing and left realizing what the job actually involved. They weren't painted villains or comic book vixens. They were women in impossible situations making the only decision that kept them alive. The worst part, most of them never had a single person in their lives who saw it that way. On number 14, the social divide, because Hollywood collapses all these women into one category, but the actual women absolutely did not. There was a rigid and fiercely enforced social hierarchy among them. At the top were the proper saloon and dance hall girls, entertainers, saleswomen, performers. They were not prostitutes, and they were genuinely offended to be treated as such. Below them were the parlor house girls working in higher-end establishments. And at the very bottom were the crib girls. Here's what few people know. A dance hall girl who was mistaken for a prostitute could and frequently did react with real fury. The distinction mattered enormously to them. It was the one line of respectability they could hold on to in a world that had taken nearly everything else. The crazy part is that polite society refused to see any difference between them at all. They were all just fallen women. End of story. On number 13, profit sharing. And let's talk about the economics from the owner's side, because this is where the exploitation really reveals itself. The saloon owner marked up his whiskey between 30 and 60% over wholesale cost. He then charged the girl for her room in the saloon, her costumes, her food, and in some cases her makeup. On top of that, he took his cut of every dance ticket she sold. She received a percentage of every drink she convinced a man to buy, but the percentage came off an already inflated price that she had no control over. The whole system was engineered so that no matter how hard she worked, the owner was always profiting on multiple levels simultaneously. Sound familiar? That's basically the modern gig economy. The worker takes all the personal risk, performs all the labor, and the platform takes its cut from every single transaction. Some business models are apparently timeless. On number 12 is one of the most quietly sinister facts on this entire list. Forbidden love deliberately sabotaged. Saloon owners were not just indifferent to their girls falling in love. They actively worked to prevent it. If a patron was spending too long at one girl's side, buying her drinks, monopolizing her time, showing signs of genuine attachment, the owner would intervene. He would reassign the girl, limit the man's access, or outright ban extended conversation. Because here's the business reality. The single greatest threat to a saloon owner's income was marriage. A girl who got married left, and a girl who left had to be replaced, retrained, and re-promoted to the crowd. So owners managed their girls' romantic lives like inventory. They weren't running a social club. They were running a machine. And emotions were a mechanical failure risk. And nobody ever told the girls this when they signed on. On number 11, armed and dangerous. Because the image of a fragile saloon girl waiting to be rescued is one of the great lies of Western cinema. The reality, most of them were armed. Pistols were tucked into garters. Daggers were slipped into bodices. Small derringers were hidden in boot tops. This wasn't bravado. It was survival math. Lawmen in the Old West operated by an unofficial but very consistent rule. Disputes involving working women were not their problem. A girl who was assaulted, robbed, or threatened inside a saloon had essentially no legal recourse whatsoever. So, they handled it themselves. There are documented accounts of saloon girls drawing on men twice their size and making the point very clearly. The crazy part is that this image, the sharp, armed, self-reliant woman of the frontier, is historically far more accurate than anything John Wayne ever appeared alongside. Hollywood just never found it convenient to tell that story. On number 10, lethal consequences for disrespect. And it wasn't just the girls who enforced order. The saloon itself had its own brutal justice system. Saloon owners genuinely required, that customers treat the women with a baseline of respect. Not out of decency necessarily, but out of business logic. A girl who was roughed up couldn't work, couldn't sell, couldn't dance, and a saloon with a reputation for tolerating abuse of its girls lost the girls entirely. So, the consequences for serious mistreatment were severe. Being permanently banned was the most common outcome. Being physically removed at gunpoint was documented. And in the most extreme cases, being killed by the saloon keeper or a group of patrons who took offense, that happened too. There was a recorded incident in Tucson where a man who refused an offer was escorted at gunpoint from bar to bar across town until he had, quote, learned some manners. Old West justice was informal, but it was rarely slow. On number 9, the Madam's Private Police. Because official law enforcement offered these women essentially nothing, some of the more powerful madams built their own parallel justice systems. They hired private bouncers, men who were paid specifically to protect the girls from assault, robbery, and abuse. These were not gentle deterrents. They were chosen for size, reputation, and willingness to use force. Some high-end establishments ran what amounted to their own internal courts, where a man who crossed a line faced consequences that had nothing to do with the sheriff's office. And here's what makes this remarkable. These systems actually worked better for the women than the official legal structure did. Rape, assault, and robbery against working women were almost never prosecuted in frontier courts. But cross the line in the wrong establishment and the madam's private force would ensure you never made that particular mistake again. Private security has always filled the gaps that public law leaves behind. On number 8, the code words. Because Victorian society had a fascinating relationship with the world it simultaneously consumed and condemned. It couldn't openly discuss what happened in the upper rooms of frontier saloons. So, it invented an entire vocabulary to refer to it sideways. Working girls who provided adult experiences beyond dancing were known variously as soiled doves, horizontal employees, ceiling experts, ladies of the evening, or sporting women. The establishments themselves were sporting houses, parlor houses, or houses of accommodation. Here's the detail nobody talks about. This coded language wasn't just about modesty. It was a legal and social shield. As long as nobody said the actual word, the city government could keep issuing the licenses, collecting the fines, and maintaining plausible deniability. Everyone knew. Everyone pretended not to. A tradition that has, it must be said, continued robustly into the present day. On number 7, Sleep and Steal, the gold dust heist. And in the mining towns of California, Colorado, and Nevada, some operations ran a sideline that was almost elegant in its simplicity. A girl would identify a miner who had come in flush. Gold dust in his pouch, a good season behind him, and enough whiskey in him to collapse a horse. She would work him carefully. Flattery, more drinks, a gentle invitation upstairs. Once he passed out, which was always the plan, she would quietly go through his clothes, his belt, his boots, and relieve him of his gold dust or nuggets. Some madams not only permitted this, but trained their girls to do it efficiently. The miner would wake up hours later, head pounding, gold gone, with only the vaguest memory of the previous evening. Most never reported it. Some didn't even realize it had happened until they were 2 days down the trail. It was theft dressed entirely as hospitality, and it was widespread enough that it shows up in multiple independent historical accounts across different states. On number 6, the government's cut. And here is the fact that reframes the entire moral structure of the Old West. The government wasn't ignorant of what was happening in saloons and parlor houses. It was profiting from it. In city after city across the frontier, local governments issued formal licenses to madams and saloon owners that permitted their operations to continue in exchange for regular fees. In many towns, working girls were also required to pay monthly fines, sometimes around $8 a month, directly to the city treasury. In St. Louis, Missouri, a formal piece of legislation called the Social Evil Ordinance required permits for all working women and mandated that they obtain a clean bill of health from a city-appointed physician, a physician they paid for out of their own pocket. The city was simultaneously criminalizing these women's existence and funding its own operations on their earnings. The line between law and exploitation was not just blurred, In most frontier towns, it had been erased entirely. On number 5, the crib reality. And at the very bottom of the frontier hierarchy were the crib girls whose world was as far from the Hollywood saloon as it is possible to imagine. Cribs were tiny single-room shacks on the outskirts of town, often barely large enough for a bed and a small table. They were sometimes identified by a red lamp burning in the window. The women who ended up there were typically the oldest, the most worn down by years in the life, the ones no parlor house or saloon would take anymore. They charged as little as $1 per encounter. They had no bouncers, no madam, no protection of any kind. Violence was constant. Disease was rampant. Syphilis moved through these communities like a slow fire, and there was no cure. As one historian put it, this line of work never had a good retirement plan. The cribs were where that retirement came to collect. On number 4, the trap. Because on paper the wages looked like freedom, but in practice they were a gilded cage. Most saloon girls arrived in debt to the owner who had paid for their travel, their costume, their room, and their first week's meals. That debt was logged, tracked, and charged with interest. The costume they wore rented from the house. The room above the saloon charged weekly. The food deducted. Some owners deliberately kept the accounting opaque, just fuzzy enough that a girl could never quite get to zero. And as the months turned into years, the lifestyle itself became the trap. The noise, the smoke, the relentless social performance, the constant threat of violence. These things left real marks. Anxiety, depression, chronic back pain from hours of dancing in corsets and waiting at every corner. The easiest solution the frontier pharmacist could offer. It wasn't weakness that drove these women to addiction. It was arithmetic. On number 3, toxic beauty. And every single night they went to work, they were slowly being poisoned. Not metaphorically. The cosmetics available to saloon girls in the 1870s and 80s were by modern standards medically catastrophic. Face powders were frequently lead-based. Lip tints contained vermilion, a compound of mercury sulfide, which over time caused neurological damage, tremors, memory loss, and skin deterioration. Some skin lighteners contained arsenic. Eye preparations used antimony. And because these girls applied their makeup heavily and daily, the cumulative exposure was brutal. Here's the darkest irony of this fact. They had no idea. The connection between these ingredients and the symptoms they were experiencing was not widely understood. They thought the trembling hands and the confusion were just exhaustion. They went back to work and applied the makeup again. The most dangerous thing in that saloon every night wasn't the drunk with the pistol. It was the powder on the vanity. On number 2, the laudanum and opium epidemic. And in the late 1800s, laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was legal, cheap, and available at any frontier pharmacy without a prescription. Doctors prescribed it freely for menstrual cramps, anxiety, headaches, insomnia, and practically anything else that ailed a patient. By the late 1800s, women made up more than 60% of all opium addicts in America. Think about that. The typical opiate addict of the Victorian era was not a criminal. She was a working woman whose doctor had handed her a bottle. For saloon girls, already exhausted, already in pain, already using alcohol to take the edge off each night, laudanum was the logical next step. Some madams actively encouraged it. An addicted girl was a dependent girl. A dependent girl wasn't going anywhere. By 1900, estimates put the number of opium addicts in the United States at 250,000. Nobody called it a crisis. Nobody launched a campaign. They just kept selling it over the counter. Some lessons apparently have to be learned more than once. And on number 1, the darkest entry on this entire list, the Christmas suicide spike. Every year without fail, as December arrived in frontier towns across the American West, one number climbed. Documented historical records from the era consistently show a sharp increase in suicides among saloon girls and working women every Christmas season. Think about why Christmas was the one time of year when every human instinct screamed home, family, warmth, belonging. It was the cruelest possible reminder of everything these women had left behind or lost or never had. The letters home that were never answered. The children they'd had to give up. the mothers who had stopped writing. On top of that, illness was rampant. Tuberculosis, syphilis, the slow damage of years of this life. All of it compounding quietly in the background. Hollywood ends its saloon girl stories with a sunset ride and a handsome stranger. History ends too many of them on a cold December night in a room above a saloon with no one coming to knock on the door. These women have been flattened into set decorations for over 100 years of westerns. The drinking girl in the background, the joke, the rescue target. But the reality was something else entirely. These were women who built economic lives in a world designed to give them nothing. Who armed themselves when the law refused to protect them. Who created their own hierarchies, their own codes, their own versions of dignity in conditions that were genuinely brutal. And the system that surrounded them, the owners, the city governments, the physicians, the pharmacists, profited at every single turn while pointing the moral fingers squarely at them. The saloon girl was never really about the saloon. She was about what happens when a society refuses to give half its population a fair hand and then judges them for how they play the cards they're dealt. That story didn't end with the frontier. It just changed addresses. So, which of these 20 facts genuinely shocked you? Drop it in the comments below. And if any of these facts made you see the Old West differently, share this video with someone who still thinks Hollywood got it right. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next.